Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to my commentary today. In Brussels, behind the language of legal formality and technocratic calm, a line was quietly erased when the European Union agreed to indefinitely freeze Russian central bank assets. It was not merely extending sanctions, it was redefining power. This was the moment finance ceased to be a neutral system and became an instrument of permanent coercion. For decades, central bank reserves were treated as sacred ground, the last firewall separating political conflict from systemic collapse. They were untouchable, not out of goodwill, but out of self-interest. Once sovereign reserves could be seized, no state could trust the global financial architecture that underpins trade, stability, and peace. That principle is now broken. An indefinite freeze is not temporary pressure. It is economic expropriation without a declaration of war. It tells the world that property rights end where political alignment begins. The distinction between sanction and seizure has been deliberately blurred, creating a precedent that cannot be reversed by legal arguments or moral claims. Europe may frame this move as justice, as leverage, as a necessary response to aggression. But history is indifferent to intentions. What matters is the signal. And the signal is unmistakable. Sovereignty is conditional, contracts are political, and financial neutrality is over. This decision does not isolate Russia alone. It fractures the trust that holds the international monetary system together. Every central bank, every finance ministry, every sovereign wealth fund is now forced to ask a dangerous question. If reserves can be taken today in Europe, who is safe tomorrow? Sanctions were once designed as signals calibrated, reversible, and ultimately subordinate to diplomacy. What the European Union has now embraced is something far more radical. The indefinite immobilization of Russia's central bank assets marks the moment sanctions mutated into financial warfare, a strategy not to influence behavior, but to impose permanent damage. In warfare, the objective is not persuasion. It is deterrence through pain, dominance through denial. By crossing from temporary restriction to open-ended confiscation, Europe has adopted the logic of the battlefield while remaining in the language of bureaucracy. This is not economic policy. It is the weaponization of the financial system itself. The danger lies not only in what is done, but in what is normalized. Once finance becomes a tool of punishment, every ledger turns into a front line. Payment systems, reserve currencies, and clearinghouses all are transformed from infrastructure into instruments of power. Neutrality vanishes, trust evaporates, and without trust, global finance ceases to function as a stabilizing force. Europe may believe this escalation increases leverage over Moscow. In reality, it locks both sides into an irreversible spiral. Financial warfare leaves no exit ramps. Assets can be frozen, but credibility cannot be restored once shattered. The message to Russia is stark. Compliance will not guarantee restitution. Restraint will not restore sovereignty. More dangerously, the message to the world is even clearer. If financial access depends on political obedience, then diversification becomes a matter of survival. States will not wait to be targeted. They will move reserves, reroute trade, and dismantle their exposure to Western systems before the next crisis arrives. What is unfolding is not a pressure campaign against one adversary. It is the fragmentation of the global financial order itself. And in that fragmentation, Europe risks discovering a hard truth of power. Systems designed as weapons tend to collapse as systems. Russia will not answer Europe's financial escalation by mirroring it. Moscow understands a core rule of power. Retaliation is most effective when it is asymmetric, unexpected, and targeted at structural weaknesses rather than symbolic assets. What Brussels has frozen on paper, Russia will counter in the real economy where leverage is slower to detect, harder to reverse, and far more destabilizing. The first arena is Western assets inside Russia, billions in European corporate holdings, industrial plants, logistics hubs, and banking operations sit exposed under Russian jurisdiction. Unlike frozen reserves, these assets are tangible, operational, and politically sensitive. Retaliation here would not be announced as punishment. It would be justified as regulation, security, or temporary administration. The legal language would echo Europe's own, but finance is only one layer. Russia's deeper leverage lies in energy and strategic commodities, sectors where Europe remains structurally dependent despite years of denial. Gas flows can be adjusted, maintenance cycles extended, nuclear fuel deliveries delayed, and uranium enrichment access restricted. None of these requires dramatic gestures. Each can be framed as a technical necessity. Together, they form economic pressure that accumulates quietly, relentlessly. Beyond energy, Russia controls choke points in fertilizers, grain logistics, and rare inputs critical to European agriculture and industry. These are not headline weapons, but they shape inflation, food security, and political stability. Financial warfare invites this kind of response because it erases the boundary between economic policy and national survival. Most consequentially, Russia will accelerate its exit from the Eurocentric system, reserve diversification, non-Western clearing mechanisms, and bilateral trade in national currencies. These trends were already underway. Europe's decision transforms it from a long-term strategy into an immediate imperative. Moscow does not need to escalate militarily to impose costs. It only needs to remind Europe of an uncomfortable truth. Financial power is fragile when it is detached from material reality. By choosing seizure over settlement, Brussels has invited a contest not of balance sheets, but of endurance, one in which retaliation unfolds slowly, deliberately, and far beyond the domain where Europe believes it still holds control. The most consequential audience for Europe's decision is not in the Kremlin. It is in Beijing, Riyadh, New Delhi, Brasilia, in every capital that holds its national savings inside Western financial institutions. What Brussels has done is send a signal louder than any speech. Sovereign reserves are no longer sovereign. For decades, the euro and the dollar were not merely currencies. They were trusted instruments. States accumulated them not because they loved Western politics, but because they believed in the system's neutrality. Central bank reserves were assumed to be insulated from geopolitics, protected by law, custom, and mutual restraint. That assumption is now obsolete. An indefinite freeze, followed by open discussion of nationalization, tells the world that reserve assets are conditional, contingent on political alignment, strategic obedience, and moral approval from those who control the system. This is not a technical shift, it is an existential one. Once that realization settles in, rational states do not protest. They adapt, reserve diversification away from euros, accelerated accumulation of gold, expansion of bilateral trade in national currencies, investment in parallel payment systems. None of these moves requires confrontation. They require only prudence, and prudence in this context means distancing oneself from a system that has revealed its capacity for permanent confiscation. Europe may believe it has demonstrated strength. In reality, it has demonstrated unreliability. Power can compel behavior in the short term, but trust determines architecture in the long term. Once trust erodes, systems fragment, and fragmented systems do not favor those who built their influence on centrality. In attempting to punish one adversary, Europe has weakened the very foundations of its financial influence. Reserve currency status is not enforced by law. It is sustained by confidence. And confidence, once broken, does not return through press releases or legal rationales. When escalation becomes too dangerous in one domain, great powers do not retreat. They expand sideways. Europe's financial offensive narrows the space for compromise in Ukraine, but it widens the arena of confrontation far beyond it. This is the hidden cost of financial warfare. It pushes conflict outward into regions and systems that were never meant to carry the burden of great power rivalry. Russia does not need to answer Europe on the battlefield to change the strategic balance. It can shift pressure into energy corridors, maritime choke points, and critical infrastructure where Europe's assumptions of stability are weakest. The Arctic, the Black Sea, the Eastern Mediterranean, Africa's resource belts, these are not peripheral theaters. They are connective tissue in the global economy. Disruptions there reverberate through prices, supply chains, and political systems thousands of miles away. Undersea cables, pipelines, and shipping lanes become strategic vulnerabilities not because they are attacked outright, but because they are no longer guaranteed. Insurance costs rise, transit slows, investment hesitates. Financial warfare invites this ambiguity because it dissolves the boundary between peace and conflict. Everything becomes contested, yet nothing is formally declared. Energy, once again, sits at the center. Europe has convinced itself that diversification equals independence. It does not. It merely shifts dependence across suppliers and routes that are themselves exposed to geopolitical pressure. A delay here, a maintenance issue there, a regulatory change framed as technical compliance. None of it looks like retaliation. All of it accumulates. The same logic applies to food, fertilizers, and strategic minerals. These are not weapons in the cinematic sense. They are slow forces. They work through inflation, social unrest, and electoral backlash. Financial war does not seek dramatic collapse. It seeks political fatigue. Most destabilizing of all is the extension of confrontation into the global south. As Europe and Russia contest influence through finance and resources, third countries are pulled into transactional alignments they did not choose. Aid becomes leverage. Infrastructure becomes a bargaining chip. Neutrality becomes costly. The world fragments not into blocks of ideology, but into networks of necessity. Europe may believe it has contained escalation by avoiding direct military confrontation. In truth, it has unleashed a broader contest, one without rules, timelines, or clear endpoints. Horizontal escalation is quieter than tanks and missiles, but it is far harder to control. It spreads risk across continents, markets, and societies that never voted for war. This is the paradox of financial warfare. By avoiding the visible costs of conflict, it multiplies the invisible ones. And once those costs diffuse into the global system, no capital, not Brussels, not Moscow, retains the authority to stop the chain reaction it has set in motion. Europe now stands before a contradiction it can no longer avoid. In the name of defending international law, it has undermined one of its most fundamental pillars, the inviolability of sovereign assets. This is not a tactical misstep. It is a moral and systemic rupture, one that will echo long after the war in Ukraine fades from the headlines. A rules-based order survives not because rules are written, but because they are predictably upheld even under pressure. When exceptions are carved out for political necessity, rules do not bend, they fracture. The indefinite freezing and proposed nationalization of Russia's central bank assets signal that power, not principle, is now the final arbiter. That lesson will not be forgotten. The greater danger lies in normalization. Once asset seizure is accepted as legitimate statecraft, it becomes available to all future crises. Today's target is Russia. Tomorrow's may be any state that defies prevailing power structures. Europe cannot claim surprise when others prepare accordingly. Prudence demands preemption, not trust. What follows is not chaos, but erosion. Confidence drains slowly from institutions that once anchored global stability. Central banks hedge, not out of hostility, but out of survival instinct. Legal assurances lose weight. Financial diplomacy hardens into transactional bargaining. The invisible architecture of trust, painstakingly built over decades, begins to decay. Empires often believe they can rewrite rules without consequence, mistaking dominance for permanence. Yet systems held together by coercion rarely endure. They provoke workarounds, alternatives, and eventually replacements. Power that relies on fear accelerates the search for escape. Europe's tragedy is not that it has chosen strength, it is that it has confused strength with seizure, leverage with expropriation, and justice with irreversibility. In doing so, it risks becoming a participant in the very disorder it claims to resist. The world that emerges from this moment will not be defined by declarations from Brussels or Moscow. It will be shaped by quieter decisions, by where reserves are held, how trade is settled, which systems are trusted, and which are quietly abandoned. No summit communique can reverse those choices. Once made, when trust collapses, power rushes in to fill the void. But power, unbound by rules, does not restore order. It merely postpones reckoning. And in the long arc of history, that reckoning always arrives.